How's it going, everyone? I'm Dylan, this is All You Can Board, and this is the first video in a new series I'm going to be doing on the channel. Probably, I don't want to say every month for sure, but maybe every month, every couple months, depending on how much you guys are enjoying the video. And this is going to be a versus series. So I've wanted to do something like this on the channel for a while, and I wasn't sure what format I was going to take. I think I've landed on one I really like. And so basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a certain number of games from my collection. In this case, today we're looking at 8 games, and I'm going to be doing a bunch of two-game matchups, 1v1. So in this case, we'll have 4 matchups today. And I'm going to pick games that have, whether it's similar mechanics, similar themes, similar player count, similar box size, just some sort of thread that ties them together, and then decide if I had to keep one and get rid of the other one. I could only have one in my collection. Which one would I keep and which one I wouldn't keep and why? So I'm not going to actually get rid of one of the games, but this might also inform, future decisions I make with games leaving my collection or other videos like that you see on the channel. If I'm having to decide, which games to get rid of, maybe this will help inform that, but it's not going to actually be binding that I have to get rid of one of these games. And the other thing to keep in mind before we get into this is I obviously like all these games because otherwise they wouldn't be in my collection. So this is a good game and this is a bad game. It's just if I was forced to make that decision, some of them might be grueling decisions because I love both. Which one would I keep? My hope here is that helps inform you guys, that if you guys are deciding, I want to buy a new board game and I want one that is for 2 players or a party game or this type of mechanic or polyomino game or whatever, that you can only buy one, maybe this will help you decide which one to choose based on some of the things I say. So this will just be a fun series and we'll see how it goes. Let me know if you guys like the series, if you guys have any recommendations for games you'd like to see me compare. Obviously it has to be ones that are in my collection, but yeah, let's just jump right into it. We're not gonna waste any more time. The first matchup we're gonna do today is a set of polyomino games that not only have that mechanic tied between them, but also a very similar theme tied between them. So I thought it'd be an interesting one to look at, and that is going to be Barenpark versus New York Zoo. So the interesting thing about this one specifically is that if you had asked me to do this about 6 months ago, I would have had a reverse answer of what the answer I'm going to give today is. So maybe a bit of a spoiler ahead of time if you guys know what I would have said 6 months ago. But my thoughts on it have changed for a number of reasons. So before I get into which one I'm going to pick, let's give a quick little breakdown of each one. So Barenpark is a polyomino game that has a zoo theme, much like New York Zoo. And in this one, you're going to have your own personal board. You start with 1, and you're eventually going to get 3 others that is going to form a 4-board zoo that is completely your own. You're going to be adding tiles to this zoo every single turn, and you're going to be doing that based on icons that you cover on your board. So if you cover, say, the dump truck icon, you're going to have a choice of tiles to grab from because you covered that one. Or if you cover the orange crane, you're going to have a different selection of tiles that you can grab from. So depending which ones you're going to grab, what you're trying to accomplish, you're trying to cover up icons at the right time of the game in order to try to beat your opponent to some of these tiles, or grab the more valuable tiles, because the tiles on top of some of the piles are worth more points than the ones at the bottom. So if you get there first, you're going to get more points than your opponent. And if you find that your opponent has beaten you to a couple stacks, suddenly you might have to change your strategy and go for other ones because you have to make up those points that they kind of have over your head. So there's an interesting dynamic about, like, it has that race element, but unlike New York Zoo, it's racing to specific tiles rather than just racing to the end of the game. But you still also want to try to keep up with your opponent on how quickly they're completing their zoo, because when you complete your final 4th board, that's going to trigger the end of the game. At the same time, there's also achievement tiles that are optional, but I would recommend just including them in every game. It makes things more interesting. They'll give you certain things to shoot for, having certain animal enclosures in your zoo, a certain number of them, or linking a bunch of things together. It makes things a little bit more fun. And there's also these statues that after you surround a certain construction icon on your board, this like little construction hole, you basically get to put a statue of the next highest value available into that spot. So again, you're sort of racing for those as well. Very fun game, very simple and easy to teach. And the only thing I've ever found with Barenpark is if I play a lot of games close together, sometimes they can start to seem kind of similar. I think it's a game that it's better played kind of spaced apart. There is an expansion that you can get that I don't personally have. I think it's called like Bad News Bears or something to do something like that. That will add more, variety and stuff. And obviously the achievements add more variety as well. But that's really the only thing I found with Barenpark, is I love it as a simplistic polyomino game. But just if you play too often, I found that sometimes the scores and the flow of the game and how it goes, I feel like, yeah, that's pretty similar to the last time I played. But again, it can be mitigated a little bit. New York Zoo is a full-blown race game polyomino in the sense that as soon as someone completes their board, they win the game. So you're having to effectively complete your polyomino board with spatial awareness, and if you are the first one to do that, you are going to win. So I haven't seen that very often in polyomino games. Normally, you don't have to be the first one to complete it. You might just lose points or having empty spaces. This one, you just want to finish your board. The big twist on it is that you have these animal meeples, and every tile you place is essentially an enclosure that can hold animal meeples on it of a single type. And you're going to be trying to fill up that enclosure, so the bigger spaces take longer to fill up. And when you do, you're going to have bonuses applied to that for having completed a tile. And at the same time, you're moving this marker, this elephant marker, on this main board, and that's sort of deciding which tiles you're going to take and also which animals you're going to place on your board. So New York Zoo adds a whole new level of complexity that you might not be expecting from polyomino games. That whole managing the meeples thing, it honestly takes a bit to wrap your head around. That's sort of my criticism of New York Zoo, is that as much as I enjoyed and have a great time every single time I play, introducing new people to New York Zoo, every single time there's a barrier to entry, a hurdle of getting over understanding the meeples and how they come into play and when to trigger them, and how there's little intricacies in the rules too. They're kind of fiddly in terms of storing animals in your own personal board before you place them into the enclosures. But also, I'm not going to get into them all, but there's a reason the New York Zoo rulebook is one of my least favorite rulebooks. It's because there's a lot of stuff in there that took me a while to wrap my head around, and that's one of the reasons I did a how to play video for it. So I feel like that's the biggest downside to New York Zoo, is just the added complexity doesn't always feel necessary to the enjoyment of the game. I feel like where I pull the most enjoyment isn't from the complex aspects. It's from the racing and the actual polyomino placement and picking them from the boards. So I wish that there was an easier way for them to have integrated the animals, but it also is very unique and very cool, and I still have a good time playing with it. So which one would I keep and which one would I get rid of? 6 months ago, I would have said I would have kept New York Zoo and gotten rid of Barenpark, because I was just having a great time with New York Zoo, and I still do to this day, but I've definitely cooled on, and that's why today I would keep Barenpark and get rid of New York Zoo. Ultimately, this comes down to when do I play polyomino games the most? And the polyomino genre is one that I often play when I'm looking for a lighter experience, when I'm introducing new gamers, because it's a very fun mechanic to introduce to new people or people that are new to the genre or to board gaming in general. And for both of those reasons, Barenpark is way easier to introduce to people than New York Zoo because of the hurdle of the animals. And ultimately, even for me personally, when I'm sitting down to play a polyomino game, I specifically am just looking to, in most cases, because I know Feast Road can be considered a polyomino game, but that's not the reason I'm gravitating towards it. That's more worker placement. And there's my mention of Feast Road in like every video. So take your shot if you're playing the drinking game. But for this, it's if I'm sitting down to play a polyomino game, Barenpark sort of scratches the itch that I'm looking for. I get to pick tiles, I get to race my opponent to certain tiles, I get to effectively try to manage the space and complete it as well as I can, and it adds in some twists with covering these icons and having a slew of different options to grab from and the achievements and stuff. So it's not too simplistic. There's enough going on to differentiate it from like games like Patchwork and whatnot. New York Zoo does those things as well, but it just adds it too much complexity for what I'm looking for in a polyomino game that I often end up choosing Barenpark over it. Even recently, both games were sort of noticed on my shelf by someone I was playing board games with, and that's when I sort of realized, they're both Zoo polyomino games, and I just recommended playing Barenpark over New York Zoo because of the barrier to entry and the unnecessary complexity. I'm making up words for this video now. Complexity of New York Zoo. So ultimately, that's where I've landed now. Still really like both games, but Barenpark would be my keep, and New York Zoo would have to go. All right, the next versus that we're gonna do is, I can't take full credit for this one, although I had thought about the comparisons between these games before, but what spurred me to include this was listening to a recent episode of the Board Game Barrage podcast where they actually talk about these two games in comparison and their similarities, and that made me want to include it on this one. So huge fan of that podcast, glad they gave me this idea. So the first game is going to be Splendor, and watch... Oh, I thought all the chips inside were going to spill over. I hate setting up the Splendor box. Splendor versus Project L. So These are very different games in terms of theme. Project L arguably doesn't even really have a theme, and Splendor, you know, has it in the form of like these jewels and these nobles and things like that. So in terms of the way they look on the table and even the way you're interacting with stuff, they're very different, but the gameplay itch they scratch and the engine building aspect are very, very similar in what you're doing in both. So Splendor is a game I've had for a while. You basically have these colored gem tokens that you're going to be using to purchase cards from a market. You can buy or choose to take these gems in your turn. You can take 3 gems, one of 3 different colors, or you can take 2 gems of the same color, and you're going to be adding them to your supply. You can have a max of 10, and you're using them to buy cards in the market. Every card you buy gives you a permanent gem of a certain color, which means that you're now making it easier to buy things by having more gems that are just inherently available to you. Eventually, you'll have things that you can just get for free because you've collected enough cards. There's 3 rows of cards. The more expensive ones are at the top. You won't be able to buy those until well into the game. Each of these cards will, not every single one of them, but a lot of the cards will give you points. The higher ones always give you points, and the first person to 15 points wins. So you're building an engine in the form of getting permanent colored gems in front of you that make it easier to buy things and racing to 15 points and seeing who can do it most effectively. Project L has these little square dual layered boards that can fit Tetris-like pieces in them. You are going to be collecting these Tetris pieces and trying to complete these boards. You're also going to be selecting new boards from the market. A board could be as simple as, you know, just needing 3 spots to fill. You might only have to use, you know, a 2x1 Tetris piece in a single square to fill it. Or it might be a very complicated staircase-like shape that you're going to have to use multiple shapes to try to complete, but you're still trying to do that as quickly and effectively as possible. Every time you complete one of these boards, you get all the pieces you used back, and you'll also get new bonus pieces that are listed on that board as well as some points. So the engine that you're building is you're constantly getting bigger pieces, you're upgrading pieces you have into more effective pieces as well. You're earning new pieces from completing these boards. So eventually you're going to be able to complete these boards quicker, more efficiently, and gain more points than your opponents, hopefully. There's also this really cool mechanic where you can essentially add multiple pieces to multiple boards at the same time. So there's a couple of different tweaks that are a little bit different than Splendor, but generally that entire flow of becoming more and more powerful as you go is something that is inherent across both games and in most engine builders. So the reason we're comparing these 2 engine builders, because these are definitely aren't the 2 engine builders in my collection, the only 2 I should say, is that they're both at similar length. They both would be sort of for the same type of gamers that you're looking to introduce these type of games to, and yet they have like very different themes. Like I said, Project L doesn't really have one. It's just these Tetris-like pieces, whereas Splendor is thematic throughout with the imagery and the cards that you're playing with. So which one would I keep? This was honestly might end up being the most grueling decision that I look at today, because I love both of these games. And I love Splendor and I've played it so many times, but ultimately I have to give the nod to Project L. And that's only because if I had to choose just one to keep, Project L is so much more satisfying to play with the pieces and integrating with, and these dual layer boards. It just feels a lot better to play with. It looks to me more interesting on the table, even though there's less color. Well, there's color in the shapes, but in terms of like the artwork and everything, it might look more interesting to have Splendor set up, or visually stimulating to have Splendor set up, than Project L. Project L is more intriguing the way it looks on a table, and playing with the Tetris shapes and having to, you know, find the best way to complete each board as effectively as possible, and when to time your action that allows you to put multiple pieces on in the same turn is just really, really satisfying and really interesting. And I find that over multiple plays, that stays interesting and you know, something that I want to come back to. Whereas Splendor can sometimes have that feeling of, yeah, I'm doing the same thing I normally do. The cards are a little bit different, but you know, I'm still playing the same way. Whereas I feel like there's a little bit more variety in Project L. So this is one that I maybe over multiple more plays, I could see myself changing a little bit, but I played Splendor a lot more than I played Project L, so that should be a testament to how much I'm enjoying Project L. And it's ultimately just a game that I find is just really fun to play and really interesting to engage with on the table. You know, we played a couple games back to back the weekend that I first picked this up, and even between those 2 games that were back to back, the way we all adapted to the strategy and, you know, adjust the way we played the games and which tiles we went for and how we timed upgrading our tiles and things like that was just really, really interesting. So if you're looking just to pick up one, my recommendation would be Project L. If I had to get rid of just one, I would get rid of Splendor, but these are such great games, both of them, in my opinion, that honestly you can't really go wrong with either one. All right, next up we have a heavy hitter matchup. These are two heavier games, both by the same designer, and both have some similarities in the way they play, but generally they play differently enough that there's, if I were to play these games back to back, they wouldn't feel too similar. And I'm talking about Teotihuacan, which I might be mispronouncing. I feel like everyone mispronounces that. City of Gods versus Tzolk'in, the Mayan calendar. So these are both heavy worker placement style games, although this one is more so like a dice placement, dice manipulation game, whereas this is much more a worker placement game. But both similarities across them, just no dice, obviously, in Tzolk'in. So I played Tzolk'in first. Tzolk'in is the game that came first, and then I got Teotihuacan after the fact. I enjoy both these games a lot. So these are games that if I have the time to sit down and play them, I am always ecstatic to play them. What I wanted to say is that I'm often gravitating towards one of them over the other, and it's sort of holding me back from playing the other one. And this is probably the matchup today where it's most likely that I could come back to the one that I say I would get rid of and actually get rid of it, because ultimately there is one of these that just does not get played enough in my collection. I'll save that to the end, but let's start with Tzolk'in because it's the game that came first. So Tzolk'in is a worker placement game with a really unique twist. I'm not going to explain all the rules, there's obviously too many to go over, but the board essentially has these plastic gears, and each gear is a different category of worker placement spots. When you take one of your little cylinder workers, you're placing it onto a spot on this wheel, and you're not taking an action immediately. You're essentially setting that worker up to be able to claim an action later. At the end of each round, the wheel is gonna spin, and your worker is gonna go to a new spot. The longer that you leave it on a disc, the better the spot is going to be that you are going to be able to take, because you only take that action when you remove the cylinder. So it's about knowing when to place your cylinders, because you always have to place your little cylinder worker on the lowest spot available. So if you notice that your opponent has claimed a bunch of spots, you could start at a way higher spot in a disc than you probably have any right to start, which means that you're going to be able to remove it and claim an action a lot quicker than your opponent might be able to do. So that makes the game so interesting to know when to place them, and also knowing how long you want to leave it on a disc before you or I keep saying disc, on a wheel, whatever you want to call it, before you remove it to be able to take the action. At the same time, it has one of the mechanics that is my least favorite in board games, but is very present in a lot of them, which is having to feed your workers. I'm not against feeding workers, it's just in board games I don't find it to always be the most interesting thing to do. So you're always also having to manage the amount of corn that you have, and you want to make sure you have enough at the end of each of the cycles to be able to fuel your workers. You can get things to not have to feed as many or to have to feed them less to make that a little bit easier. And there's a whole bunch of other things going on. Obviously, all the spaces in Tzolk'in create different routes that you can go towards victory. One of the discs is specifically for endgame points and uses these crystal skulls, which means if you're gathering a bunch of crystal skulls, you want to go to that wheel a lot to be able to place them and gain a bunch of endgame points. There's a bunch of temple tracks that you're moving up as well that you're having to manage, and you can do that by going on a bunch of different spaces. You only start the game with a certain amount of workers. One of the spaces is going to get you more workers. So lots of cool stuff going on. Honestly, for how complex it seems when you see it with all these wheels, learning it is not too tricky. It's sort of like many worker placement games where the rules are simple, and it's really just learning what all the spaces do and the iconography. And once you've learned that, it's a lot easier. One cool thing about this, and I will say it's in both games, this isn't just a nod to Tzolk'in, is there's a variable starting resource thing where you draft these tiles, and these tiles are going to determine what resources you start the game with, and that's going to be unique every single time. So you might start one game with a whole bunch of corn, and that's going to influence the strategy you begin with. Another game you might start with barely any corn, but you have a whole bunch of these other resources, or you start with a crystal skull, and so suddenly you changes the way you're going to approach it. I really like that. It's one of my favorite things about Agricola. It's one of my favorite things about Res Arcana is these variable starts and having it be different every time. Tzolk'in's is on the lighter side of all the ones I just mentioned, but it is worth mentioning because it is something really cool about the game. So Teotihuacan is a similar game in some ways and very different in others. So this is a dice placement game. So your workers are essentially going to be these dice, and the values of the dice matter. You're not actually rolling these dice. You can manipulate the values of them in different ways though. So you're going to be moving around this board in a circular fashion to all the different action spaces that are there, and each action space is going to give you something lesser or better depending on the value of the die. So going to an action space with a 1 will get you one thing, whereas going with a 6 might get you that thing plus 2 other things. So you have to kind of time when you're going there with which dice and what the value on the dice is, and manipulating these dice to be able to get higher value so you can do more with them. I think it's been a while since I played this, but I'm pretty sure the amount of dice that you have on a spot also influences what you're able to do on the spot. You get more if you have more dice on that spot. And then of course the claim to fame of this game in terms of table presence is the temple that you're building in the center of the table with these domino tiles that you're adding to, and there's a bunch of things triggering there. There's also temple tracks that you're moving on, much like Tzolk'in, where moving up the different temple tracks will get you bonuses as you go up and points at the end of the game. Again, all these worker spots that you can go to, I'm not going to go over them all or go over all the rules, but in much the same way as Tzolk'in, there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can go about winning Teotihuacan and the different strategies you can adopt. I would say it's less flexible than Tzolk'in if I'm comparing them in that way. Tzolk'in, I feel like because there's more spots and you can do them in vastly different orders. There's a little bit more variety there, but there's still, it doesn't feel too similar from game to game. It also has the same thing that I mentioned with Tzolk'in, with the starting tiles changing every single game, which means that you're going to start with different resources and have a bit of a different variable setup every time you play, which is something I really like. So I'm a huge fan of dice placement games. I find that it's just an interesting twist on using dice without having to be very random and rolling. It's one of the reasons I really like Castles of Burgundy, is it involves dice placement. It's one of the things I loved about Coimbra a lot, even though we don't have that game anymore and there's some flaws with it. The thing I loved about it was the actual dice placement and using dice as workers. Teotihuacan is the game in my collection that sort of still has that, besides Castle of Burgundy, that I absolutely adore playing because of it. So they're both about the same length of game. I think Tzolk'in is listed at 90 minutes. This is listed at 90 to 120. I would say that Teotihuacan and all the games I've played generally clocks in longer, so I would agree with that. Whereas Tzolk'in, if you're playing with 2 or 3 and you all know the rules, you can probably consistently complete it in 90 minutes or even less if you're getting into a groove with it. So if I could only keep one and I had to get rid of the other, I would keep Tzolk'in and I would get rid of Teotihuacan. And that's ultimately because I think Tzolk'in does way more unique things and is way more interesting, and it's way more impressive when I play it. And I just like the aspect of having, it's one of my favorite things about worker placements, is having all the different spots you can go to and having different paths to victory. But also in this one, not only that, you're having to dedicate a worker to something and not be able to pull them off to use that action until down the road. So you're having to plan in advance, which is very difficult to wrap your head around the first time you play, but once you get used to it, it's just a really fun twist on worker placement that I find is more interesting than the twist they have here, which is the dice workers, because I've seen that in other games. So very, very good game still. Don't get me wrong, I still really enjoy playing this. I'm not planning to currently part with it for my collection, but over time I think that I may, because like I alluded to at the beginning of the video, I often, if I'm sitting down to just play one, end up recommending Tzolk'in, or times me and Carlo have gone to the cabin and I say, well, realistically, I'm not going to bring both. We're not going to play both. Which one do I bring? I bring Tzolk'in because it's one that I'm just way more eager to play, and than Teotihuacan. It's just one of those things. So you may have a different opinion, and if you're really, really someone who loves the dice placement mechanics even more than I do, that might be one thing that gravitates you to this one more than Tzolk'in. But ultimately, Tzolk'in is the pick for me. Okay, the last matchup we're going to look at, the last versus, is one that I've actually been personally asked about a couple times in our Discord and on YouTube, and I've seen a couple other content creators cover this matchup. It's a very obvious matchup, but it is one that I happen to own both the games in my collection, so I figured I would do my take on it, and that is Quacks of Quedlinburg versus Cubitos. So these are both push your luck games with the very similar feel in terms of what you're actually trying to do and how the framework of the game is, but the way they execute that is different. So Quacks of Quedlinburg is a bag building game, and what that means is you're gonna have a bag that starts with a modest amount of tiles in there, most of them bad for you, and you're gonna be slowly adding more valuable tiles to this bag, and as you pull, you're gonna have a better chance of pulling the good tiles than the bad ones the more you add those into the bag. So the white tiles, or I think they're called cherry bombs, are going to be the ones you're trying to avoid. They have values on them, and if you ever add a certain number to your pot, which I think is if you hit over 7, you're gonna bust, and then you have to stop drawing, and you basically lose either the income that you're gonna be able to spend in the market phase, or the points that you're gonna gain from the ones you place. Whereas normally, if you don't bust, you get both. You get the points, and you're gonna get the income that you're gonna be able to spend in the market phase. So you definitely don't wanna bust. If you bust too much, you're just gonna end up losing the game. But having to manage, you know, when to push your luck more, when to say, oh, it's not worth it based on what's left in the bag, is sort of where the fun of Quacks comes in. And there's a lot of randomness in that. A lot of times you think you have built the best bag possible. You have like 20 tiles in there and most of them are good, and somehow you're still going to bust. That's just what happens with push your luck games. Generally, that there's that aspect that you just can't control. Both the games have that. So if that's not your thing, you're probably not going to like either of these games. Quacks of Quedlinburg basically has these different colored tokens that you're adding into your bag, and each one is going to have a board, and there's tons of different options of these boards you can put out that is going to explain what the ability of that colored tile is. So, you know, the blue tiles might have a certain ability this game, but next game, if you want to use a different one, you can give blue tiles a different ability. You can use different combinations as well. So every game of Quacks I've played has felt very different from the last one. I've never played with the same abilities out there. That keeps things fresh and feeling new every time you play. It's very much a game that is just, in my opinion, sheer fun. Like, that's the reason I play Quacks. I don't play for the strategy. I don't play because it's, you know, very balanced or anything like that. I play because it's hilarious. It's fun. I always have a great time. Other people who play it have a great time. It ends up being a lot of people's favorite game, and it's one that I'm just like, I like having a game like that in my collection to show people. It has a lot of setup required to it. It's one of those games that's easier to play on like Tabletop Simulator than it is to play in person, because having to set out all the tiles and get everything set up can generally take a while. So it's one of those ones you want to have set up before the game night starts, hopefully, not setting up while everyone's waiting for you. But it's like I said, I love playing Quacks. There's enough randomness that it makes it fun, but everyone has that same randomness applied to them, so generally it kind of balances itself out unless someone is really unlucky, which is usually me. But yeah, that's Quacks of Quedlinburg. Cubitos has that same pushing your luck aspect, but it's using dice rather than bag building. So in the same way as Quacks, every single color of dice is going to have its own ability associated with it, and you can change that every single game. That aspect is the same, but what you're doing here is you're rolling dice that are in your supply, a certain number of them. I think you start the game rolling 9 dice, and you're going to be able to increase that as you go in your actives and putting them in your active zone. And if you ever roll and it's all misses, you bust. So you have to look at how many hits there are in different dice and say, okay, am I going to roll again? And if you roll again and you get hits, you're moving all the hits to your active zone, and you're only asking yourself, am I going to roll what's left? So you're going to whittle it down to ones that have less of a chance to hit, and eventually you want to stop pushing your luck and say, I'm just going to take what I've rolled here. Rolling certain things on certain colors of dice or is going to obviously trigger some of the abilities that are on the cards, and everything you're doing is using these dice to move on a board in a race. So whereas Quacks, you're moving around your pot and you're adding more tokens to your pot and seeing how far you can make it in this cauldron, Cubitos, you're actually moving your token in a race across the board and trying to be the first one to get to the end of the race. So very similar mechanics in terms of the actual abilities that are associated with these cards changing every game, and the big decision maker being, do I push my luck? But bag building and dice rolling and, you know, filling up your cauldron and racing across an actual racetrack are two very different implementations of it. So if you play them back to back, you think, okay, those are very similar games. But at the same time, if you space them out, I would say that, you know, there is a reason you could own both. In my case, I do own both, and one of them has gotten way more plays than the other one, generally because the mechanics are very similar, and if I'm going to only play one, I gravitate to this one. And you may have guessed, that is Quacks of Quedlinburg. I would keep Quacks of Quedlinburg, and I would get rid of Cubitos. And honestly, there's a chance that'll happen down the road when it comes to some of the games leave my collection videos. You may see Cubitos on there. I think that it really depends also on who's going to be playing these games more. I would say that Cubitos is the one that is, they're both great family games, but I would say that Cubitos is more of a family game in the fact that in the imagery, in the race aspect, in the rolling of the dice and everything, it just feels like one that would be an easier introduction than Quacks. Quacks of Quedlinburg is still easy to introduce, and I know lots of people have said they play with their kids and things like that, but I would just say out of the two, Cubitos might be a little bit easier to have that approach with. Quacks, I just find the bag building is way more interesting to me than the dice rolling in this case. Rolling dice and hoping I roll a certain way there's luck in both, but it just feels like I have less control for some reason in Cubitos, whereas Quacks, building your bag a certain way and also like with how many of a certain type of token I'm going to put in the bag. I might go really hard in the blue tokens or the yellow tokens or whatever the case may be, or, you know, get a certain type of token because my opponent, like the black ones, because my opponent hasn't, and it'll be more often that I'll have them come up than they will. There's a bunch of different things you're considering, and the aspect of having to see how far you can make it in the spiral of your cauldron, and the further you make it, the more points you get. I really enjoy in Quacks of Quedlinburg. It's one of those things where every game I compete with myself a little bit, saying, can I make it further on the cauldron earlier than I did in previous games? Did I build my cauldron or my bag better than last time to be able to accomplish this? For some reason, the theme, the gameplay, and the mechanics, everything about it, even though they're similar, it just gravitates to me more with Quacks than with Cubitos. The race aspect isn't something that I necessarily love about games, is racing. I think when they're done right, it can be good, and Cubitos is still a great implementation of it, especially deciding to do the push your luck. And I will, to their credit, say that there's a ton of variety in the abilities that all the different colors of dice have. So I think even if I was comparing them, I think it even has more choices than Quacks in that regard. I'd have to really do the count, but I didn't before this video. But either way, like, variety is not the issue here. You're gonna have a very different play every single time you play Cubitos, but honestly, it's just hard to compete with these two games for me, because or I should say hard for Cubitos to compete with Quacks in this case, because Quacks is just such a beloved game for me. You've seen this on my top 50. Cubitos, I don't even think I had it on there. So it just resonates with me personally for some reason. But let me know in the comments if you have had Cubitos land more with you than Quacks and you've played both, because I'm really curious why that is. And not because you're wrong, like tell me why you would make such a weird decision. I'm legitimately curious what it is about Cubitos that maybe I'm missing in the plays that I've had, that you found is something that makes you think, oh, I want to own Cubitos or play Cubitos, and I don't want to own or play Quacks. So I would keep Quacks, I would get rid of Cubitos. That's my personal opinion. Let me know what you think in the comments. That is it for this video. Those are the 4 matchups. Like I said, this is the first video in this new series where every time I'm going to be looking at some games from my shelf and comparing them and finding something between them that is sort of the common thread on why I would compare them. So again, that might not always even be mechanics. It could be like, I'm going to take the 2 biggest shelf hogs in my collection and compare those, which one to get rid of if I only had space for one. We could have some fun with some of those choices and why I'm choosing matchups, but generally every time we would just look at games in my collection and compare them. So you may see some of these games pop up on a games leave my collection video in the future. The ones I said I would get rid of, maybe one day I will, but for now I'm not getting rid of any of them. I like them all. They're all staying. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed this new series. If you want to chat with us some more outside of our YouTube videos, we have an awesome Discord community. You can find the link in our description below. It's free to join. You can go come there to chat, or you can just make an account just to read what everyone else is saying. You don't even have to participate. We are 100% lurker friendly in that regard. There's no pressure to comment or engage in any certain way, but it is a cool way to keep tabs on other things we're talking about, or what some of the other questions people ask us are and what our answers are. So if you're interested, you can find that there. You can also find other ways to support us in the description, like Patreon and PayPal and merch. It's all there if that's something you want to do. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.